Are we ready to begin? Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Lindsay Maynard, and I'm the newest team member here at Modern Pilot. I'm heading up marketing and PR. And for those of you that are here for the first time, welcome. If you're a friend of Modern Pilot, welcome back. We're so excited that you're here for our seminar. So if you haven't joined us, Modern Pilot is a flight school. We emphasize scenario-based training on 1G's fleet of model-specific simulators. We want to save you time, we want to save you money, and we want to make you safer pilots, more importantly. And just a couple housekeeping notes. We are enrolling students for our private pilot ground school that starts next week on September 29th, and then our instrument rating ground school that starts on September 30th. And you can actually drop in for certain sessions of that. Jellica can give you more information if you're interested in that. And next month, if you want to join us for our seminar on October 15th, Andrew Stagg is an active Seattle pilot. He'll be speaking about flying in and out of Canadian airspace. Not as easy as you think. So tonight, we are pleased to welcome longtime FAA designated Pilot Examiner David Stahl to Modern Pilot. He'll be speaking about how to pass your check ride and mistakes to avoid. David, welcome.
Thank you. So how many folks are already private pilot or above? Okay, so a fair number. And others are students? Excellent. Have you started flight training yet? Are you in ground school? Oh, good. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today is common misconceptions and errors that pilots make and ways to avoid them. And also that leads into increasing your odds of passing your private pilot check ride the first time. And even those who are not student pilots anymore, hopefully this will be worthwhile to presentation for you too, because these errors are errors that people make well after they have become a private pilot or above. And so, and these are my observations over the past, I don't know how many years, both as a flight instructor and certainly as a pilot examiner. The nice thing about being a pilot examiner is you certainly see a whole lot more pilots than I would when I would spend 40 or 50 hours training somebody. So it's kind of nice to get a bigger picture on the world as an examiner. So some common things I want to talk about are both misconceptions, i.e. not having a fundamental knowledge of, say, aerodynamics or other factors, but also lack of skills or rusty skills that lead to pilots getting into trouble. And so the first one I wanted to talk about was stalls. And of course, stalls have been the bane of pilots since Orville and Wilbur, and they certainly crashed their airplanes more than once because of that. And unfortunately, we continue to see those types of accidents today. And it's very important then to have a good understanding of stall aerodynamics. Before you even touch the airplane, you should have a good understanding. And the thing to remember about stalls is that a wing stalls when it exceeds the critical angle of attack. And of course, you've all heard that a million times. But oftentimes it just doesn't really stick into people's mind because we also drill in, don't get slow, you don't want to go below stall speed. And so that being true as it is, it's misleading and confuses many pilots because they think it's all about speed. And of course it's not, because an airplane or a wing can stall at any speed in any attitude. It's all about the relative wind, and if your angle of attack exceeds that critical angle of attack, the airplane will stall. And so, right now, if you have any confusion about that, that's the thing to take away. If you pull too hard, you're going to stall your airplane, and it doesn't have anything to do with whether you're pitched up or pitched down, or whether you're fast or you're slow. And a classic example of how this bites people is the coffin corner turn. And hopefully some of you have heard of that before, but it's a classic example.
What did you call it?
It's called the coffin corner
Okay,
curve. And it's where a pilot is on base leg, approaching final, and he discovers that he's starting to overshoot finally. And what's the natural instinct? It's to roll into a steeper bank and tighten up your turn to not overshoot. What gets pilots into trouble, though, is they have the misconception that it's about speed. So their speed is good, it's well above stall speed, their nose is below the horizon, so they're not pitched up like they are used to being when they've stalled their airplane in the past. So everything looks great, and they roll into that steep turn, and then they make the mistake of doing this. They pull back on that elevator and increase that angle of attack beyond the critical angle of attack, and they stall their airplane at low altitude. And oftentimes, that will lead to a stall and impact with the earth. In other cases, it's even worse than that because it turns into a stall spin where there's no hope of recovering from that at that low altitude. And that occurs because what they're doing is they're rolling the airplane and they're yawing it, stomping on the rudder, trying to get that airplane turned around. And so the airplane goes into that spin, and there's just no way to recover in the 300 or 400 feet between you and the earth. So it's a very, very real danger. Has been for the past 100 years, and unfortunately it'll probably continue on for some time until, I'm not sure what we have to do.
Until the laws of physics change.
That's right, maybe that's what it is. Okay. Now, the background knowledge of the aerodynamics of a stall is obviously essential, but also your skills at recovering from stalls are really important for you to achieve them, and also to keep using them, i.e. keep practicing stall recoveries so that you're not rusty the day you inadvertently stall your airplane. And so what I recommend to everyone then is when you practice stalls, always keep the worst case scenario in mind. And that, of course, is a low altitude stall. Because if you stall your airplane at high altitude, no one's going to know, no one's going to get hurt. It's not a big deal. So even though we practice our stalls at least 1,500 feet above the ground, always envision yourself being at low altitude. And that's a really good motivator, all right? Because the earth hurts when you hit it at 70 knots. So what you want to do then is, with that in mind, you want to keep in mind what the goal is in a stall recovery at low altitude. And that is to break the stall with minimum altitude loss, and then expeditiously get into a VX climb and clean up your airplane. What do I mean by breaking the stall with minimum altitude loss? Well, it's a common mistake for pilots is to, once they stall that airplane, they overreact and they push the nose down significantly below the horizon. And that's simply not necessary most of the time, which is one of the reasons why practicing stalls is so important, is because you'll get a feel for when the wing's stalled and when it starts flying again, okay? And you can feel it. You know, the wing is burbling, you can feel it in your controls, you can feel the airplane shaking, but when you push that nose down, it'll decrease. It may not go completely away, but it goes away enough that you can realize that, hey, now I've got some control of my airplane again, that wing is indeed flying, okay? So you push that nose down just enough, which typically means just to the horizon, okay? The exception being if you have a real high nose attitude when you stall that airplane, then you'll have to push it down even further. But hopefully, if it ever happens to you inadvertently, you won't allow yourself to get in that extreme of a deck angle. But push the nose down enough so that the wing starts flying, you recognize that it's flying, and now it's time to start bringing that nose up again and getting your first notch of flaps up. And this should all happen just about the same time. You got to get the flaps up. Once you break the stall in, and the wing is flying, now you're getting your nose up to the attitude where you know the airplane can climb out at VX. All right. Once you're in that attitude, now you can start getting your airspeed indicator into your scan. Okay, before this, you're mostly looking outside trying to break that stall, but after that, you're watching your speed, and now you're bleeding your flaps up. And but being relatively expeditious about that. You don't need to take a lot of time. Once the airplane's flying, you want to get them up. Now, some people think that you absolutely cannot retract any more flaps until you have a positive rate of climb. Okay, and that's not necessarily true in all cases. Okay, now we're used to flying here at low density altitude, and so our engines are developing close to 100 horsepower, or 100% horsepower, and so we can get the airplane going at a positive rate of climb pretty quickly. But keep in mind, if you inadvertently do this someplace else, i.e. in Wenatchee or something, on a hot day, you might be in a descent until you get another notch of flaps up, just because there's so much drag on the airplane. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm not saying change your training, but keep in mind that if the airplane's not climbing and I'm in the climb attitude, maybe it's time to pull up a little bit more flaps, even though I don't have that positive rate, depending on the circumstance. And the way for you to stimulate that then is to take your airplane up at high altitude someday. Go up and do some stalls at 8,000 feet and see how the airplane behaves there, and that way you can experience that. Another area that I've seen oftentimes people are weak on, and that is knowledge of their aircraft in several different dimensions. The first one being knowledge of your aircraft systems. So you're the pilot in command, you need to be an expert on that aircraft. The more you know about that airplane, the more likely you're going to be able to diagnose and troubleshoot a problem and hopefully overcome the problem through whatever means would be appropriate. So you got to know your airplane. And a modern POH is broken into sections, and section 7 is the aircraft systems. And so you want to read through that and know your airplane inside and out. And it doesn't teach you how magnetos work. So you might have to refer to a textbook to get the background understanding on how these systems actually work. But it'll tell you, what you've got and how it operates. And so that's very worthwhile knowledge. And then the other section in your POH in particular you want to pay attention to is section 3, which is emergency procedures. And the emergency procedures, you want to do several things. You want to, of course, read through all of them, and in particular, memorize the names of all the checklists. And the reason why you want to do that is because, does your Cessna 172 have a ditching checklist? And the answer is yes, it does. How many of us have ever practiced a ditching checklist? Probably none of us, okay? But it would sure be nice to know it's there if you ever need it. So you want to do that. The next thing you want to do is go through and memorize the bold-faced items. And the bold-faced items are the items that you need to have memorized. An example of that is spin recovery. Once you find yourself in a spin, it's probably not the right time to pull out a checklist and save yourself. So it's one of those things that you have to have memorized. And we know, of course, there's others. Engine failure immediately after takeoff. Just not time. You've got to have those items memorized. Now, if you're flying an older airplane, and in particular Cessnas are my background, if you're flying a Cessna built before 1981, you're going to have to go through there with a highlighter and highlight those items that you should have memorized because they didn't print them in boldface at that point. And if you're flying in a really old airplane, sometimes the check or the POH is so thin that it's almost useless. Okay, and that being the case, though, see if you can find a later model of that airplane that you could get a copy of the POH and read up on that. But just recognize that there could be some differences, but at least it'll give you a little bit more background knowledge on your airplane. So anyway, you want to memorize the bold-faced items, and finally, beyond those checklists that contain the bold-faced items, there is the amplified emergency procedures. And that's really it's telling you the logic that went into that checklist and what you're doing when you really cycle this or turn on that. And so you want to, again, understand your systems as much as possible. After you have that memorized, then you want to drill yourself. Okay? If you're in training, your instructor's going to drill you, but your instructor's not with you all the time, and so you want to drill yourself. And by drilling, what I mean is visualizing the scenario where that checklist would be appropriate. Okay, so going back to spins then, so visualize that you're in a spin, and you can do this sitting in the cockpit without even having the engine on. You can do it at home sitting in a comfy chair. But go through and drill yourself on all of these things. And so for a spin recovery, you've memorized the checklist, but now by drilling yourself, you're actually taking the motions. And you don't need a yoke in your hand to do this. So traditional spin recovery is power to idle, ailerons neutral, rudder full opposite, briskly apply elevator, forward elevator, and recover from the dive. And note what I was doing there. I was taking the actions, okay? Because you want to make this not just a memory, but a muscle memory. And by drilling yourself, you'll hopefully make it instinctive, that you always do the right thing the first time. And that can be critical. And so some of the procedures that you want to drill yourself on then would be things like nose high unusual attitudes, nose low unusual attitudes. If you're flying a multi-engine airplane, engine failure after takeoff. Things like that. You want to drill yourself so you do it right every time. And speaking of unusual attitudes, I always like to point out the fact that people, again, have a misperception about unusual attitudes. Okay? A lot of people think that the first thing they should do is add power if they're in a nose-high unusual attitude. Other people think they want to roll their wings level if they're in a nose-high unusual attitude. And that is 100% wrong, okay? Because what's the danger when you're in a nose-high unusual attitude? Well, it's stalling the airplane. And if the first thing you do is roll your wings level, at the same time the airplane stalls, what's going to happen? You're in a spin, and now you're in a cloud, so not a very good scenario, okay? Adding power could be just as bad because that torque, if you don't correctly react to it, the airplane starts yawing. If the stall breaks at that point, away you go once again. So what makes a wing stall? Well, we already know the answer. It's the critical angle attack. If you've exceeded it, you're going to stall. So step one always has to be to push the nose down, okay? Because the elevator, contrary to what everybody thinks, does not control the pitch of the airplane. It controls the angle of attack of the airplane. And so you need to immediately get that angle of attack down before something bad happens. Then you can add power. Then you can roll your wings level. So it's a worthwhile thing drilling yourself on and thinking about the aerodynamics in it.
If you just let go, won't the plane naturally?
Depending on how it's trimmed.
Right.
So I would say drill yourself till you take the positive intervention.
Yeah.
And that way, even if it's out of trim, good things are still going to happen. You're not going to stall. Another area that people need to stay brushed up on is physiological factors. And specifically things like hypoxia, carbon monoxide poisoning, illusions, be they optical or sensory illusions. Okay? Starting with physiological factors. Hypoxia, and in particular carbon monoxide, which is a form of hypoxia, continues to kill pilots. And it's a very ugly scenario because it's hard to recognize it, in particular when you're the one suffering from it. So self-diagnosing is never a good idea, but it's the only idea we have these days unless your airplane is equipped with a CO monitor. And if you have an airplane, that might be something worthwhile investing in. But the bottom line is if you cannot recognize those symptoms down here, you're probably not going to recognize them up there. So that's why it's worthwhile studying those and thinking about them on a regular basis, so that if it does happen to you, you're more likely to catch it. And the scenario or the anecdote I always talk about is the case of an airline captain, her 10-year-old son, and a medical doctor in a Bonanza. This is probably close to 10 years ago. They were flying back from Arlington Air Show, and they got a leak in the cockpit, and all three of them died, which that just scares the heck out of me, because if a medical doctor can't recognize it and a high-time airline captain can't recognize it, you know, what chance do I stand? So I really like those CO monitors a lot. Hypoxia is somewhat less threatening, but still a threat. The one thing I would counsel you is, if you ever have a chance to go into an altitude chamber, take advantage of it. I don't think they have one here, but I do know that they have one over at Fairchild over in Spokane. If you ever find yourself in that part of the world and have a chance where they have an opening for civilian pilots to come in and experience that, it's a very worthwhile thing. Optical illusions and other sensory illusions. Again, that's a worthwhile thing to brush up on from time to time. You know, we probably all studied about the black hole approach, but as a review, that's an approach when you're coming in on a long straight-in final at night, and the illusion then is that your brain misperceives that you're higher than you actually are. And so the chance is then that you're going to come in lower, and airplanes have touched down significantly short of the runway. And one particular example I know of was a C-5 touching down a half-mile short of the runway and tearing its landing gear off. Fortunately, that was a big enough airplane that no one got hurt. It just made a big trench in the ground. But it happens to the most experienced pilots. And the reason why I bring it up, not to talk about them so much, as to encourage you to go back from time to time and refresh yourself on all of them, because there's a relatively long list of them, and yeah, right now it may be in the back of your mind, but that's probably not where it needs to be if you're going to recognize it and keep yourself out of trouble. So again, always brushing up, always trying to keep these dangerous scenarios at the forefront of your mind so that you can avoid them. Density altitude is another area that's often a weakness for people. And one of the problems is frankly, it's somewhat, I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but the concept of density altitude gets confused in people's mind because when we talk about high density altitude situation, what we're talking about is low density air. And that sometimes gets people really confused. Okay, so you just need to keep in mind what we're talking about when we're talking about high density altitude is the fact that in Denver on a hot day, our airplane doesn't perform nearly as well as it does in Seattle on a cool day. And so you need to keep that, that Denver hot, high, possibly humid scenario in your mind. And again, that's one of those that needs to be in the forefront of your mind so that one day when you go over to pick up an airplane in Montana in the summer, or you're taking the family over to Colorado, Western Colorado on vacation, that you keep in mind that this airplane is not going to perform nearly as well as I'm used to. And it's very important then that the alarm bells start ringing and you start thinking, before I do this, maybe I need to pull out my POH and do some performance calculations. And one thing I like to do with new pilots is have them do a sea level calculation and then a calculation on a hot day in Colorado and compare things like takeoff distance, rate of climb, landing distance. And what you'll see is that it's not uncommon for your takeoff distance to double and your rate of climb to be cut in half. And so it's not even going to feel like the same airplane anymore. So, but those alarm bells need to go off while you're on the ground and not after you've gotten airborne going, oh shoot, what have I done? The other thing that confuses people is the speeds to fly in a high density altitude airport. In particular, your landing speed. The airspeed indicator automatically compensates for density altitude. And so if you look in your POH, you'll find that it doesn't say the stall speed for the airplane at sea level or 5,000 feet. It just says the stall speed. And that's why. It's because the airspeed indicator automatically compensates for that. And therefore, when you come into land at a high density altitude airport, you're going to fly the same approach speed that you always do. But if you do your performance calculations and you take a look at your landing distance in particular, what you're going to discover is that your landing distance in Colorado on a hot day is also going to go up. Now, it's not going to double like the takeoff distance because the engine's not part of the equation, but your true airspeed is higher, therefore your ground speed's higher, therefore it's going to take longer to stop the airplane. And again, that's one of those things that gets people in trouble. And a personal anecdote is I had to go over and get an airplane out of a chain link fence at an airport in the mountains here because the owner of that airplane had the misconception, and so not only was his true airspeed going to be higher, but now he decided he needed to add an extra 15 or 20 knots because he was in a high density altitude situation, and he just ran out of runway and rolled off and tore up his airplane. So again, just review those things. So again, they're at the forefront of your mind, and the alarm bells go off when they should be going off. How many folks are instrument pilots or working on their instrument rating? Okay, so a fair number. All right. So, well, I was thrilled tonight to learn about the simulators here. I hadn't seen them before, and Zana and I were talking earlier about the capabilities of them and the fact that you can do realistic failures on the airplane systems, be it the engines or avionics or instruments. And in particular, what I was interested in is the fact that you could realistically fail your attitude gyro. And so for those who have, are instrument pilots or working on that, I would recommend having somebody beat you up in one of those simulators and show you all the nasty things that can happen to you in real life. In particular, attitude indicator failures. And in the past, I've always told people, well, this is one that we can't simulate very well. You're just going to have to sit down and visualize it. And so, as an instrument pilot then, we're all, of course, trained to fly partial panel. And the traditional way then is you're in an airplane and your flight instructor covers up your attitude indicator and your directional gyro, and now all of a sudden you're forced to fly your turn coordinator, your airspeed, and your altimeter. There's just no choice. He covers them up. You can't see them anymore. But that, of course, is not what happens in real life. And gyros don't fail just like that most of the time. So they're sneaky. And so what they really do in real life is they fail very slowly. And what happens is you, as a pilot, have been trained to focus your life on that attitude indicator. And so you fly that airplane, that little airplane on your artificial horizon, and you keep it wings level. Unfortunately, once it starts tumbling ever so slowly, that's not really wings level anymore, and away you go. Ever so slowly, but away you go. And by the time you recognize that you have a problem, you can be in a horrible, unusual attitude. And so it's very worthwhile thinking through that scenario, or nowadays, even going in the simulator and flying that scenario so you can see what it's really like, because it really does kill people, including the governor of Missouri about 15 years ago. And the thing to remember about your ability to fly the airplane partial panel is it's very limited. Okay? The reason why we can successfully fly an airplane without an attitude indicator and just using a rate gyro is because we keep our pitch and our bank angles relatively low. And so if you find yourself in a horribly perturbed state, i.e. an extreme bank or extreme pitch, there just really isn't enough information that turn coordinator is giving you to successfully recover. An example of that would be, just imagine if you got to the point where you were actually partially inverted. You've gone beyond the 90-degree point. And what's going to happen in that situation? Well, of course, the airplane lift is not going up against gravity anymore, and so the airplane's going to start a descent. And even if now you realize that your attitude indicators failed on you, and you're going to try to fly partial panel with your turn coordinator using your airspeed and your altimeter, what is your instinctive action going to be? Well, it's going to be to pull because your altimeter is winding down. And of course, if you're partially inverted, away you go. But even if you realize that, hey, my attitude indicator is the problem, and you do ignore it, and you realize that this is something you might do, you might pull down, which way is up? And the answer is you don't know. Maybe you're banked to the left, maybe you're banked to the right. And so you don't even know whether I should turn right or I should turn left, which takes me back then to recognizing that gyro failure early on, so you can do that unusual attitude recovery early before those angles get out of control. Now, so you want to keep practice on your unusual attitude recoveries, and again, fly a good simulator that can realistically handle those or present those to you, and think about them. You know, drill yourself every now and then. Another area, going back to the VFR pilots, that oftentimes is trouble for new pilots, and that is navigation. Okay? And a lot of examiners think that navigation skills have degraded over the years because people are getting more reliant on GPS, and that's probably true. Although, you know, most flight instructors are still trying to emphasize those basic skills, and I think they need to be emphasized. Just the other day I was doing an instrument check ride, and we had a GPS failure where we lost all but 2 of the satellites. Unfortunately, it was an instrument check ride, but it was a beautiful VFR day, and so we didn't get in any trouble. But it was shocking to me because I hadn't seen that happen in like 15 years. But in any event, instrument pilots, or I'm sorry, non-instrument pilots, private pilots, you want to keep your old-fashioned navigation skills honed. And because, you know, I have other scenarios where people's iPad had frozen on their check ride or failed otherwise. And so you've got to be ready to do that.
So
Now,
you're talking about like VORs. And
what's that?
you're talking about like VORs, being able to find yourself.
Oh yeah, and we'll talk more about VORs and GPSs, but right now I'm just talking about old-fashioned navigation the way Wilbur and Orville would have done it, and everybody up until the day that, you know, ADFs, you know, came into common use back in the 30s. So pilotage and dead reckoning. Now, as a review for those who haven't thought too much about it lately, pilotage is using your chart and looking at the world and determining where you're at and whether you're on course and making corrections based on your visual observations. Dead reckoning then is just that. You're reckoning where your position is going to be based on your true airspeed, the forecast winds, and you know, variation and applying all those things. And so dead reckoning is why you do your navigation log. One of the reasons why you do your navigation log. So it allows you to calculate the heading that compensates for all of those variables, and also allows you to calculate your time so that you know that at this time I should be over this checkpoint, at this point I should be over this checkpoint. Now, you'll notice that whenever you've read or going through a ground school, or had your instructor talk to you about pilotage and dead reckoning, he or she almost uses them as if they were one word, pilotage and dead reckoning. And the reason why is because pilotage all by itself is remarkably inaccurate unless you're really familiar with your area. And that's because if you're not familiar with the area, every lake looks like the next lake. And so it's really easy to glom onto something and go, oh, there's my lake over there, and boom, and in reality, your lake is over here. And away you go on down the primrose path. Dead reckoning, of course, is inaccurate because number one, how many of us are that good at holding heading? Not me. Okay, so you're always weaving a little bit, and they're only forecast winds. They may or may not be right. And how many of us have seen winds that were completely wrong? Well, probably all of us. So dead reckoning by itself is not that accurate either. If you just try holding a heading and turning when your watch says to turn, you're not going to end up at your destination unless you're just really lucky. All right. So that's why they are one word, and you should think of them as one word because pilotage and dead reckoning have to be used hand in hand. And so how do you do that, or how does one make the other one more accurate? Well, obviously, pilotage would work great if you were completely familiar with every place you're ever going to fly. You know, when we fly around here, we don't get lost, and we don't do a navigation log. We don't have to do pilotage and dead reckoning because we recognize everything. So pilotage is a great technique, but only in that limited circumstance. Dead reckoning of course, is almost never accurate. So, but you combine the two, and you can get them very accurate. And the reason why is because you're correcting for errors from each of them, or of each of them, by using the other technique. And specifically, what I'm talking about then is using dead reckoning to assist you in pilotage. And how do you do that? Well, first off, after you do your calculations and you start flying your airplane in a disciplined manner, i.e. flying your headings, paying attention to your time, and using your chart and looking where you're supposed to be based on what your dead reckoning says. And that's how you recognize that that can't possibly be my lake because it's too close to me. My next lake is still 5 minutes away. I can't even see it. So don't go glomming off on that one. Okay? And so dead reckoning is a key component. And I can't tell you how many times on checkrides I've seen people get terribly, terribly lost doing that way. And actually 2 days ago, I ended up almost in the Olympic Mountains out at Tacoma Narrows trying to go to Shelton, which was really interesting. And it's because he didn't even have his chart open, and he was just flying strictly a heading. And away we went. And the directional gyro started precessing. And if he had had his chart out, he would have recognized that there's not supposed to be a big lake right here, you know. So that's why you have to combine those. So I encourage you to challenge yourself from time to time. Yeah, GPS is great, VORs are great, but challenge yourself. Every now and then go out and just turn that stuff off, or at least ignore it, and go plan yourself out a relatively demanding, not too demanding, but a little demanding, cross-country where you're trying to hit your points exactly on and making corrections and using your chart appropriately. GPS. GPS I'm a big believer in. I think it's wonderful, except it has its limitations, as I already pointed out. A lot of people these days are flying with iPads and ForeFlight and all those nice new additions to the cockpit. Again, I'm a believer in that, but be prepared for failures and and think about what your contingency plans will be. You know, if the GPS does fail, what can I do? Well, obviously having a nav log and a sectional with you and being prepared to fly it is a good idea. Having a plan how to use your VORs to get yourself back on course is another good thing. As a private pilot, many of the airplanes that people are flying in these days have this latest equipment, and it gets neglected. And I would just encourage you that as you're training in your airplane, you become adept at using whatever equipment you have in the airplane. So if it's a GPS-equipped airplane, at a minimum, know how to use the direct mode, so you can take yourself directly to an airport or to a VOR. And not only know how to program it, but actually practice flying it. Because that's another thing I've seen before. Somebody will program in a waypoint, and it draws a pretty magenta line on the moving map, and the person keeps going this way, even though the GPS is telling them the right way to go. So you need to practice it, you need to use it properly. And that's true with everything. If your airplane has an ADF, at least learn how to home, if not track, using an ADF, because all those things can save your bacon. I wanted to talk a little bit for the student pilots about VORs. And VORs have been a nemesis for student pilots ever since they first appeared on the Earth. And I think the primary reason for that is because we measure courses in degrees. And frankly, there's no other way to measure them. But we measure courses in degrees. And that confuses people, because when we think about degrees, we typically are thinking about what's our heading. And so that gets boggled up in people's mind of relating VOR information to heading information. And the two are not related for the most part. All right. So VORs, you can think of them as a means for drawing an invisible line on the face of the Earth. So if you dial in a particular course off of a VOR, this line is projected. All right. Now we can't see it, but we have our CDI in the cockpit that tells us our position relative to that. And so that's really the key thing that you really need to always remember, is VORs are giving you position information. And so if we dial in this, and let's say this is the 230 course, and in our cockpit then we have set our OBS to 230, and now it's the needle will deflect depending on where we are, okay? And so what you have to remember is that the VOR then is projecting this as if you are pointed in that direction. So you have to visualize, okay, if I was pointed 230, where would this line be in relationship to me? So if you're down here, well, and you visualize that you were pointed this way, I'm not saying you are pointed that way, you are pointed this way, then you can see that that course line would be to the right of you. So your CDI would be deflected to the right. Now, again, it's really important to remember, it has nothing to do with your heading. You could be pointed any direction at all, right? But you're still to the right of this course if you were trying to parallel it right now. And that's what gets everybody confused. And it's just something that you just need to work on over and over again. And the beauty is with simulators, you can fly these various scenarios and get a better conceptualization of what's actually happening to your airplane. But step one is to visualize that you are on whatever this heading is that you set. And then what you do now is, once you know you're to the right of it, you're going to pick a heading, if you want to intercept it, that would intercept it. Now what would be a good heading? Well, it really depends. 30 degrees is often not a bad intercept angle, and so we see that we want to turn to the right of 230, 30 degrees, simple math, 260. So we would turn to a heading of 260. If we're in a bigger hurry, maybe we add 60 degrees, okay? Maybe we're in a huge hurry and we turn 90 degrees. If you go beyond 90 degrees, of course, now you're not going in the right direction anymore. So there is obviously a limit. Now, the other thing to remember about VORs is that it will take you a physical amount of time to go from here to here, even if you go to a 90-degree intercept. So you turn perpendicular to this course. This is a finite distance. You know, it might be 5 miles, might be 15 miles. So what you really need to do then is you need to have some patience and let your intercept work. And knowing if it's shallower, it's going to take more time. And what I've seen in the past, of course, is people, especially on check rides, get terribly impatient. All right? Well, don't get impatient on your check ride, and don't get impatient in real life. No, it's going to take some time. So the classical example, though, is that somebody will decide that, okay, a 30-degree intercept is going to work just fine. So they turn to heading 260. And, of course, maybe this is 10 miles, and this needle's not moving terribly fast. Maybe not at all. Maybe it's at full-scale deflection because they've got a ways to drive before they get on that course. All right? But what happens is they will give it maybe a full minute before they realize that it's not moving, or it's not moving as fast as I would like. And what they then do is then they turn another 30 degrees, but this time they're kind of excited, so they maybe give it 30 seconds. So then they give it another 30 degrees, but now they're really excited. Now they give it 15 seconds. And the bottom line is they end up doing this. And they end up back at the same spot that they started from just because they just didn't have any patience. So it's really important to recognize what the VOR is telling you and that it takes a finite amount of time to travel any distance. Okay?
Of course, none of us are going to do that.
No. Okay. A final scenario I would like to talk to you about, and it's probably everyone's worst nightmare. Certainly isn't fun when it happens, and that's an engine failure. But they still happen. Fortunately, not very often, knock wood, but they do happen. And of course, you have to have the skills to deal with that situation right then and there because there's no pause button. So this is something that you need to practice and that you need to get yourself to the highest degree of skill that you can, and then you need to practice it from time to time to keep that skill honed. Now, of course, there's a lot of different scenarios on engine failures. There's engine failure on takeoff, in which case, you don't have time or altitude to do much except land straight ahead. There are other scenarios where maybe you're high enough that maybe you can fly a base leg before you turn. And those are tough scenarios. You got to play with the hand you're dealt. But what I would like to talk about is a scenario where at least you have enough altitude where you could maneuver your airplane to successfully land. Okay. In other words, it's not a no-wind scenario. There's a wind. So you've got enough altitude, and so if you've got the skills, you can make it work. And that's what you should practice. You should practice the low altitude ones too, or at least think through them. But you want to practice handling a situation where if my engine ever fails and I've got enough altitude and I've got a nice place to land, I can always make my landing safely without hurting myself and hopefully without even hurting or damaging the airplane. All right. So when your engine fails in that scenario, of course, you're going to immediately pitch for best glide, pick a spot to land, get your carburetor heat on immediately, point your airplane immediately at your landing area, and then start your troubleshooting, checking your fuel and all those things, magnetos. And after you do that, of course, and the engine hasn't started, now you're going to have to continue on with the scenario. Now, if you read the Airplane Flying Handbook, the FAA publication, it talks about different methods, but the one I'm a big believer in involves something called the key position. So step one then is you pointed your airplane at your landing area, You're now committed to landing, and you need to look at this farmer's field or whatever it is and visualize a runway on it. And so once you visualize your runway, and it can be skewed this way or that way because of terrain or obstacles or whatever, but you visualize what a runway would look like on there, and you visualize where your winds are and where you would like to touch down. So we'll say we want to touch down right there. The next thing to do is visualize traffic pattern. Most of us like left-hand patterns, so we'll visualize a left-hand pattern. And this is what a normal left-hand pattern looks like. And your goal then is to get to this point right here. And this point right here is called the key position. And it is located on the downwind, abeam the touchdown point. And your goal then is to get yourself to the key position ASAP. And you want to get there going the correct direction, i.e. you don't want to be going this way, you want to be going in the downwind direction. So if you're over here, don't fly directly to it, fly to your runway and do a 180. Or if you're over here, it's a pretty straight shot. The key position is where you're going to spiral down and lose your altitude. And so it doesn't matter if your engine fails at 3,000 feet or 13,000 feet, get there. Okay. And once you get there then, you're going to start your spiral. And if you have enough altitude, you're going to get a rhythm to it, and you're going to see that you're losing 700 feet or 800 feet or whatever the magic number is every time you do a 360. And eventually you'll get to a point where you see that you have more altitude than you can kill with one more spiral, but not enough altitude to do two more spirals. And I unfortunately forgot to mention, the goal then is to spiral down to 1,000 feet AGL. And why 1,000 feet? It's because where we land, it's where we land airplanes from. Every time you've ever landed an airplane, this is where you started out, on the downwind at 1,000 feet AGL. So you're spiraling down to 1,000 feet AGL, and let's say you get here, and now you are, say, 1,200 feet above the traffic pattern altitude, that 1,000-foot AGL point. What do? Well, you turn this into an oval. So you do a 180-degree turn, you roll out, and then you lose half of your altitude. In this case, you're going to lose 600 feet. So you lose 600 feet, you do another 180, go back, you lose the second 600 feet, and you get here almost exactly at 1,000 feet. Once you're there at 1,000 feet, you know what to do. You've done this a million times. And so what you've done is you've turned an abnormal situation into a normal situation. And so you roll out on downwind, you turn base early because you don't have an engine, but you practiced that before too, because every time your instructor's ever had you land out of an engine failure in the pattern, he's always pulled your engine right here. So you've practiced to do this. So what you're doing then is you're falling back on your training. And that's what you always want to do. You always want to train the way you'll fly and then fly the way you train. And I can't tell you how many times in oral examinations I'll ask an applicant, how are you going to do this? And they'll give me this story and they'll tell me it's going to be great and this is what I'm going to do. And then when we go out to the practice area and I fail their engine, they invent a brand new procedure. Now the only thing I've not seen is somebody try to split S down to the runway, but I've seen almost everything else, okay? And one of the worst ones is somebody will go out here and then spiral down and then crash right here because they lost all their altitude 3 miles away from where they were going to land. Okay? The beauty of this technique is if you screw it up, at least you're really close to where you're going to land. So you turn a base even earlier, maybe even just go directly into just a 180-degree turn, but you got some options when you're close to it. If you go far away, you don't have so many options. The other classic example, or classic mistake, I should say, is that people are so worried about being too low. They're scared to death of being too low. And because obviously they don't want to crash right here. What they forget though is that the trees at this end are just as hard as the trees at this end, so you really don't want to hit either one. And so what you need to do is keep your altitude normal. Now, what I like to teach people is I like to teach them that when you're on your downwind, you keep your speed at best glide plus 5 to 10 knots. If you find yourself low on final without an engine and you're at best glide, what can you do about it? The answer is nothing. You're already at best glide. It doesn't get any better than that. So if you're low, you're going to stay low and you're going to touch down short of where you were trying to touch down. If, however, you're carrying an extra 5 or 10 knots, what you can do is you can pull your nose up and slow down to best glide speed and hopefully stretch your glide out far enough that you make it to your intended touchdown point. So anyway, that's my technique. Different instructors have different techniques, but it's something to keep in mind is don't paint yourself in a corner. Once you're on downwind, everything is pretty much rote initially because you don't have enough visual cues to tell you whether the winds are affecting you dramatically, whether you're high, whether you're low. So you're kind of doing this part by rote. And if I'm in a Cessna, what I normally do is I put in a notch of flaps and then let myself lose 200 feet. So I'm at 800 feet AGL when I turn base. And then I'll put in another notch of flaps. And once you're on base, you have a little bit more of a visual cue of how you're doing altitude-wise, but it's not perfect. But once you turn final, then you can look out the front and you can see that spot in the windscreen that's not moving. And that's your impact point. So if you don't flare it, that's where you're going to hit. And that's a very big cue. Now you know what to do about your airplane because now you can tell if you're high or you're low. Now, it's really important that at this stage of the game, you are truly the pilot in command of the airplane. Okay, because all this preliminary stuff has gotten you to a place where you can hopefully successfully land, but you got to take advantage of the situation. Okay, and so many times I've seen people come here and they planned on being high, and guess what? They are high, but they don't react to it. All right? So as the pilot in command, you're always looking out the window and assessing the situation. It doesn't matter if it's this scenario or any other scenario. You're always assessing and you're always asking, is what I'm doing working? And if the answer is no, then you need to fix it right away. Don't wait. If you wait too long, it's not going to be fixable, especially for this particular scenario. So you have to fix it early on. And so you've got, if you're high, we already talked about if you're low, if you've got some speed, you've got an option. If you're high, you've got more options, okay? Because you can do things such as put in all your flaps. If that doesn't work, slip the airplane in addition to having flaps. If that doesn't work, turn the airplane while you're slipping the airplane with full flaps. But do whatever it takes as the pilot in command to make this work, which takes us back to practicing and getting your skill level high enough and keeping it polished enough that if you ever find yourself in that position, you can handle it. So that is all I have for this evening. I just wish you all good flying, and remember you're the pilot in command, so make it work. Questions about anything?
I just want to make a comment about land. It's a great article in the recent AOPA magazine at my home airport in Burlington.
Mm-hmm.
He's following another plane's doing touch and goes at night. And he goes like, okay, well, I'm on downwind, I'm going to come in, I'm going to go ahead and land. And he's about to touch down or close to it when the runway lights go off on him.
Oh, yeah.
Because he didn't key him in himself. So
That was a good article.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read that one yet.
It just made me nervous just reading it.
Yeah. Well, and go-around skills are another one worth keeping polished as well. So, yes, sir.
Sorting for the ATP check rides you administer, what's the number one mistake you see pilots make on those?
I would just say not being instrument proficient, and and unfortunately, I've seen that in very high time pilots, and they're flying very technologically advanced airplanes, but they've become spoiled. And so they're using their autopilot so much, and they've been flying jets so long that by the time they come back to get their ATP, and they're in a piston twin, Seminole is a good example. It's just a harder airplane to fly. I mean, there's nothing harder than single pilot, piston multi-engine IFR. That's the worst job. I shouldn't say the worst. That's the hardest job on the planet. And when you get spoiled because you've got the best equipment and you've got a co-pilot watching over you, that really bites those kind of folks in the butt. Most the guys who are coming from hauling checks over the mountains in Senecas all winter and they come to do their ATP, they typically have golden hands just because they're exercising their skills every night. So I guess the bottom line is proficiency.
In terms of knowledge, are there any areas you usually see as weak for the ATP, for the oral?
Yeah, not particularly. The ATP, if you look at it, you'd think it's a giant instrument check ride, but if you look at the PTS, the oral is really about the airplane systems and the performance of the airplane, and in some some calculations or planning, looking at airport diagrams and those things, but it's not terribly demanding from the oral point of view, but the tolerances are just really tight on the flying portion, and that's what gets people. Almost no one ever fails with oral.
Thanks.
Anyone else? All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.